G'day folks, it's Will here from Flow Mountain Bike, and this is the all-new 2023 Scott Genius. As you can tell, it looks nothing like the old model, and instead it shares a lot more in common with the latest Spark. Indeed, there's a whole bunch of fresh tech with this new Genius, though Scott is also introducing a new variant called the Genius ST. Now in this video, we'll be going to some of the details behind the new Genius and the Genius ST, but more importantly, we'll be talking about how both bikes ride on the trail. We'll be discussing what we like, what we don't like, and who they're for. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. Sitting in between the Spark and the Ransom, the Scott Genius is the Swiss brand's versatile long travel trail bike. It features an entirely new frame for 2023 and it's now purpose-built around 29-inch wheels. Fork travel is increased to 160mm, though rear travel remains at 150mm. It still has a 4-bar suspension platform, though the layout has changed considerably, with the rear shock now hidden away in the belly of the frame. The suspension is controlled by a twin-lock remote up at the handlebar, with the top two levers giving the rider access to 3 distinct suspension modes which can be adjusted on the fly. The remote doesn't connect to the fork on the Genius ST model, however, and the shock function is a little bit different on that bike, which we'll touch on in just a bit. The idea behind the integrated shock is to hide it away from the elements like dust, mud, water, and bike cleaners. Scott also claims that the internal shock helps to lower the bike's center of mass and that the frame is stiffer thanks to the enormous junction between the down tube, the seat tube, and the 92mm wide press-fit bottom bracket. There's a standard length trunnion-mounted shock inside there, and it's driven by an alloy linkage which connects to the external rocker arms via a splined interface. Compared to the old Genius, which mostly featured bushings, the new frame employs sealed cartridge bearings at all key pivot points, and some of those also feature external bearing shields. The theme of integration extends up to the cockpit on the new Scott Genius. There's a large 1.5-inch head tube which gobbles up the cables and the rear brake hose as they route internally through the upper headset. Along with the matching Syncross stem, you do get a seriously clean and stealthy front end, irrespective of our thoughts on this particular routing method. It's worth noting that the Acros headset features additional tight-fitting bearing shields which are designed to keep moisture away from the bearings in the first place, and in our experience of long-term testing on the Scott Spark, it's a system that does work well. Unfortunately, there are no molded-in guide tubes for the cables though, so individual foam tubes are used to stop the cables from rattling around inside the down tube. It all works fine, but compared to a modern Specialized or Trek, replacing a cable on the Genius is going to be a more time-consuming affair. As mentioned before, Scott will also be introducing a new Genius ST model. Standing for Super Trail, the Genius ST features exactly the same frame, wheel size, and travel as the regular Genius. It also features a remote up at the handlebar, but it's called the Track Lock and it only links up to the rear shock. This means on the top-end model, Scott has been able to spec the Fox 36 with a Grip 2 damper instead of the Fit 4 damper. The shock itself is also different. It's a brand new design called the Float X Nude, and it features a piggyback reservoir and adjustable low-speed compression damping. The 3 suspension modes are also different between these two bikes. On the regular Genius, the first mode is called Descend, where both the fork and the rear shock are wide open. The middle mode is called Traction Control, and this shuts off part of the rear shock's air volume, making it more progressive and limiting rear travel from 150mm to 100mm. It also increases compression damping inside the shock and up at the fork. The final mode is a full lockout. On the Genius ST, the first mode is also called Descend, and that is where the rear shock is wide open. The middle mode, however, is called Ramp Control. Now this shuts off part of the rear shock's air volume, again increasing progression and limiting rear travel from 150 to 100mm. However, it does leave the compression damping wide open. It's only when you shift into the final climb mode where the compression damping is closed off, leading to a very firm and almost locked out feel. Along with a more aggressive Maxxis Minion DHF on the front, The Genius ST has quite a different character on the trail, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. There have also been some big updates to the geometry on the new Genius. Like the Spark, the Genius adopts modular headset cups, and these allow you to slacken or steepen the head angle by a full degree. The regular Genius comes with the headset cup set in the steep position, and that gives you a 65-degree head angle. On the Genius ST, the cups are set in the slack position, and that gives you a 64-degree head angle. The seat tube angle is the same on both platforms, and that is much steeper than the old bike at 77 degrees. Reach has also grown. That comes in at 460 millimeters on the medium size here, and so too has the stack height, which is partly due to the longer fork, but also due to longer head tubes. One thing to note on geometry is that unlike the previous Genius, there are no flip chips on the new frame. This means that there's no real way for accounting the change in bottom bracket height if you wanted to run a mullet setup with a 27.5-inch rear wheel. As such, Scott doesn't recommend it on the new Genius. Now, there will be 7 Scott Genius models coming into Australia for 2023, and pricing's going to start at a bit over $5,000 for the Genius 940. As part of the Genius launch, Mick travelled over to Aosta in the Italian Alps to test out the Genius ST 900 tuned on some properly big mountain terrain. While it certainly impressed, we were keen to try out the Genius on more familiar home terrain, and so we organised to test out this Genius 910, which I've been riding for the past month. As such, we won't be going into a lot of detail about the individual spec, but we will be discussing our collective experience of testing both the regular Genius and the Genius ST. I will mention that the Genius 910 I've got here came in at 14.32 kilos, that's with the tyres set up tubeless and weighed without pedals. It's worth noting that this bike uses a hybrid frame with a carbon front and an alloy rear, and it's claimed to be around half a kilo heavier than the full carbon HMX frame, which comes on that top-end 900 tuned model. If you want to see more detail on frame weights, complete bike weights, specs and pricing, all of that information is in the full review over at flowmountainbike.com. Just click the link in the video description below. To suit Mick's height of 178 centimeters and my height of 175 centimeters, we've both been testing a medium size in the new Scott Genius, and it's both fit us really well. It's got a decent stack height, and we've had no issues with the sweep profile or 15mm rise of the one-piece Syncross cockpit, which has proved to be comfortable out of the box. Bigger sizes do come with a 25mm rise handlebar, but overall adjustability is limited with this integrated design. If you did want to fit a higher rise handlebar, we would recommend sticking with a Syncross stem in order to maintain the tidy cable routing. As for rear suspension setup, there's a nifty sag indicator built into the rocker link, which also shows you how much travel you've used throughout the ride. Scott recommends 30% sag for the Genius, and to access the shock, there's a large plastic hatch underneath the down tube. This uses a new push-button system, which is a notable improvement over the twist lock design found on the Spark. And once the hatch is off, you've got easy access to the shock's air valve and damping adjustments, and it's also relatively straightforward to pull the shock out of there when it comes time to service. Right, so what do we like about the new Scott Genius? Well, regardless of what you think about the extravagant levels of integration, it's hard not to be impressed by this bike's striking silhouette. Indeed, the fact that Scott was able to build a long travel bike in such a space-efficient package makes it a true engineering marvel. Thankfully, it backs up its good looks on the trail. This bike is terrifically versatile, and we've been thoroughly impressed by its wide-ranging usability. We say this because a lot of bikes in this travel bracket tend to be designed for heavy-duty enduro riding. Typically, these bikes are biased more towards descending performance, which is fine for shuttle-assisted riding in bike parks and modern trail centres. In comparison, the Genius is decidedly more of an all-rounder. Having been born in the Alps, this is a bike that's designed for tackling big mountain passes in order to access those far-reaching, lesser-ridden descents. On the trail, the Genius feels crisp, sporty, and light on its feet. The handling is responsive, particularly with the head angle in the steeper position, though the stiff chassis is a big contributor. The Genius is solid underfoot, and the steering feels precise. Of course, one of the big stories with the Scott Genius is its clever twin-lock system. On the regular Genius, it's all about the middle traction control mode, which makes a profound difference to the overall character of this bike. It sits higher in its travel, steepening the seat tube angle and lifting the bottom bracket, And the suspension is also firmer and more responsive under power. You still get decent traction though, which is complemented by that big 2.6-inch wide Maxxis dissector. With the added compression damping, overall stability is fantastic, so the suspension doesn't wallow when you need to get out of the saddle and reef on the bars. Along with the extra ground clearance, there are very few trails that the Genius can't winch its way up. And indeed, with that traction control mode engaged, this is a remarkably adept technical climber. The Genius ST is also a good climber, though its attitude is a little bit more relaxed. That middle ramp control setting limits rear travel to 100mm, though because it leaves the compression damping open, you actually get better traction compared to the regular Genius. Furthermore, because the fork remains wide open, it can continue absorbing the terrain out in front. Of course, the downside is that the fork will dive whenever you get out of the saddle. And so while the Genius ST is a great climbing bike in that ramp control mode, it does tend to suit more of a sit and spin climbing style. Click the remote back into the descend position, and both the Genius and Genius ST revert back into their plush and long travel form. The rear suspension is nice and active with masses of grip on tap. Compared to the kinematics on the old bike, the new Genius features a mostly straight progressive leverage rate. The result is great initial sensitivity and comfort, improved mid-stroke support, and a more consistent feel throughout the 150mm of travel. Bottom-out control is superb. Even with the inline nude shock on the regular Genius, I never once hit full travel. Of course, the Flodex nude shock in the Genius ST is even more supportive thanks to its bigger bottom-out bumper. As for what we don't like about the Scott Genius, while it is impressively engineered, it's not exactly the quietest bike. The finned brake pads rattle around in the calipers, which can be partially solved by spreading out the pad springs or just replacing them entirely with a non-fin variety. The rear axle lever also has a bit of play, and the clutch in the Axis derailleur isn't as strong as a Shimano equivalent, which leads to more drivetrain noise on big compressions. It's not exactly a big deal, but you do notice those noises more on the Genius due to that cavernous downtube amplifying vibrations. Thankfully, the cables have been well managed on our test bikes, though we're still not into the headset cable routing, which simply adds complication to maintenance and adjustments. We'd like to see more armour along the underside of the downtube since the carbon is pretty thin in this area. Scott has also missed a trick with the lack of mullet compatibility, and the omission of any in-frame storage seems odd given how much the theme of integration has dictated the design of this frame. Also, while the supple and fast-rolling Maxxis dissectors are a great match for the Genius, clearance is very tight through the rear of the frame. We've not had any issues with rubbing or mud buildup on wet rides, though those in muddier climates may want to look at fitting a narrower 2.5 or even 2.4-inch rear tyre. The main turn-off for most riders, though, is going to be the remote-activated suspension and the extra cables it brings to the cockpit. If you don't like remotes, then this bike is simply not for you. The Genius is purpose-built around its multi-mode suspension system, and you really need to embrace the remote in order to get the most out of the bike. This is because it doesn't pedal amazingly well in that open descend position. There's quite a lot of leverage in the first part of the travel, and that means the Genius feels quite soft under power in that descend mode. Really, you need to make use of that traction control mode to boost pedaling response when you're riding along undulating terrain. The remote itself is fine, and it only takes a few rides to get used to, though ergonomics certainly aren't perfect, and adjustability could also be better. Those quibbles aside, it is the remote-activated suspension which provides the Genius with its impressive versatility. It allows you to easily adapt the suspension on the fly with settings that are optimized for climbing and descending, rather than expecting the one suspension setup to do it all. While we do love what the twin-lock system brings to the party, on longer travel bikes it does create limitations in terms of the fork damper. That's exactly where the new Genius ST comes in, which offers improved adjustability and high-speed control thanks to its Grip 2 fork damper and Flodex nude shock. The ramp control setting is also an interesting feature. Mick found himself using this mode whenever he wasn't descending, as it provides a tighter and more enthusiastic feel at the pedals. The increased progression also makes it useful on flowy jump trails, and because it doesn't add compression damping, it's no biggie if you descend down a rocky trail, having accidentally left it in that middle mode. In this sense, the ramp control mode isn't unlike the shapeshifter function on the Canyon Strive. Now, compared to the Genius ST, the regular Genius is the more efficient and livelier option for all-round riding. It is better suited to active riders and those that are seeking out more technical climbs, as its added support from the traction control mode makes it more responsive. Of course, it also has a full lockout mode, which is an important feature for many riders. Now, if you're wondering how the Genius compares to some of the competition, I've also been spending a lot of time lately on the Trek Fuel EX, which, despite some similarities, is quite a different bike on the trail. If you'd like to know more about how the two bikes compare, there's a detailed comparison in the full review over at flowmountainbike.com. There's also more detail in there about sizing and suspension setup, as well as specs and pricing for the full Genius range, so make sure you click the link in the video description below to check out the full review. Now, if you've got any questions for us about the new Genius, make sure you drop those into the comments below. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time. Tooroo!